I was already dressed for the day, sitting at the kitchen table with a hot cup of coffee and the morning paper. Janet was still back in the bedroom, getting ready for work herself. To be honest, there was nothing about that morning that felt out of the ordinary. It seemed just like any other workday from the past year. My eyes drifted over the headlines on the front page, and then I saw it. Right in the center, bold as could be. I knew it would show up there. Carmen had told me the night before it was coming, and Carmen, well, he always keeps his promises. Man found dead in his garage. The article explained that a guy named Robert Toldson had been discovered dead in his garage the previous evening. Apparently, he'd been assaulted and then strangled. It mentioned that Robert worked for Calcas Realty Agency, the same place where Janet was employed. According to the story, the police didn't have any suspects yet, and the investigation was just getting started. There really wasn't any point in reading further. I closed up the paper and set it down in Janet's usual spot at the table. As I sat there, a strange, almost comforting warmth settled over me as I mentally ran through all the events that led up to that moment. I took another sip of coffee just as Janet walked into the kitchen. Man, she was beautiful, no denying it. Even after 5 years of marriage, she looked more incredible to me than she did the day we met 7 years ago. We didn't bother with the usual good morning, honey or anything like that. Janet simply pulled out her chair, poured herself a cup of coffee, and sat down. Hard to believe how far our marriage had fallen in the last year. We glanced at each other for a second, and I gave her a small, acknowledging smile. She didn't say a word. That's how it had been for the last couple of months, ever since we had that big argument about her longer hours at work. She seemed to shut down emotionally, barely saying anything to me. The coldness from her hurt more than I liked to admit. Early on, when we were dating and in the first stretch of marriage, Janet was always warm and affectionate. I really missed that connection. But it felt like we were at the end of the road. Janet picked up the paper in one hand and her coffee in the other. Her eyes darted over the headlines, then moved down the page as she took a sip. Suddenly, she choked and spit out her coffee, her eyes going wide with shock. "Oh God, no," she cried, her attention glued to the article about Robert Toldson. I just sat there quietly. There was nothing I needed to say. Janet looked like she was going to be sick as she got up quickly and rushed to the bathroom. I let out a slow breath, stood up, put my coffee cup in the dishwasher, grabbed my briefcase, and headed for the garage. I didn't bother to check if Janet was okay. At that point, it just didn't seem to matter anymore. Let me back up and introduce myself. The name's John Canla, but my buddies just call me JC. I'm 29, born and raised in the Italian neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and my roots are pure Sicilian. Most of my younger years were spent getting into trouble with a bunch of other Italian kids from the neighborhood. We like to think of ourselves as the junior mafia. I'll skip the details of all our mischief and just tell you about the one thing that really turned my life around. Carmen Vitalio and I were tighter than brothers. Same age, same crowd, always together. The big difference between us? Let's just say Carmen didn't have much luck when it came to avoiding trouble with the law. I'm not saying he was slow, but somehow he always ended up getting caught, even when we were both up to our necks in the same mess. One night, Carmen and I broke into a warehouse down by the docks, hoping to snatch some things we could sell for easy cash. I guess the security guys must have spotted us sneaking in through a side window, because as we were climbing back out with boxes of MP3 players, they were waiting for us. One guard grabbed Carmen just as I turned around. The other tried to grab me, but I shoved the box in his face, jumped on his back, and gave him a hard punch on the side of his head. He let go of Carmen, and I managed to pull him down. I was yelling for Carmen to run for it, and he didn't need to be told twice. The other guard got back up and grabbed me from behind, and after that, it was pretty much over. The guards roughed me up a bit while they waited for the cops. When the police arrived, they were joking around with the guards, taking in the sight of me, bruised and bloodied. They took me to the station and stuck me in a holding cell until my parents came down to bail me out. Long story short, I never gave up Carmen's name. I ended up doing 2 weeks in jail and was put on probation. Carmen called me a few times after that to apologize for ditching me when things went south. I told him not to worry about it, since if he'd been caught with his record, he would have been looking at real prison time. He promised he'd find a way to make it up to me, even if it took the rest of his life. My parents were furious and embarrassed about my arrest. My dad gave me a serious whipping with his belt, and after that, told me they were sending me to St. Peter's Catholic High School, hoping some discipline would straighten me out. And honestly, the nuns and priests there didn't mess around when it came to discipline. By senior year, I'd started turning things around. One of the priests really took me under his wing and pushed me to get on a better path. I finally left the gang behind and got my grades up enough to get accepted to Penn State. Skipping ahead, college went pretty well for me. I graduated with a degree in human resources and had no trouble landing a solid job right after. For the first time in a while, my parents were genuinely proud of me. I dated quite a bit in college, but I wasn't looking for anything too serious. That changed about 3 years after graduation when I met Janet Fasanio. She was the first woman who made me seriously consider settling down. We met at a seminar for HR folks. I got her number, told her I'd call, and she actually seemed pretty happy about it. Janet was different from anyone I'd dated before. She had a lot of layers to her personality. Sometimes she even reminded me of that character from the Three Faces of Eve. If I had to pick a flaw, it would have been her stubbornness. Once she got an idea in her head, there was no changing her mind, no matter how off base it might be. Our relationship had its ups and downs. During the first year, we didn't get physical. Janet moved slow in that department. I eventually found out she'd been abandoned as a baby. Her mother left her in the back pew of a church and never came back. She grew up in an orphanage, then bounced around foster homes as a teen. I think not having a mother's love growing up left Janet with some deep-seated issues. Still, when we were together in those early days, she was the warmest, most caring person I'd ever known. My parents weren't huge fans of Janet while we were dating. They warned me I might regret getting too involved, but I didn't listen. Janet and I got married in a small church ceremony. We both agreed to wait on having kids until we were more financially stable and Janet could eventually quit work to be a full-time mom. That plan didn't exactly thrill my folks. Things started to go south in our marriage around year 3. The company Janet worked for got bought out, and she lost her job. She was pretty down about it, even though we were still fine money-wise. Her paycheck had always been a nice boost to our savings, but we weren't hurting. After several months, Janet finally found another job, but it wasn't one she was excited about. She ended up as office manager at Calcas Realty Agency. I did my best to be supportive while she was unemployed, but sometimes I felt like she resented that I was still doing work I loved, while she had to settle for something else. She had some rough mood swings, especially once a month. After a few months at Calcas, she slowly started to bounce back to her old self. Things were looking up again. Our marriage, which had hit a rough patch, was on the mend. There were even times in the bedroom when Janet seemed determined to make up for lost time, showing more affection than ever. I sure wasn't complaining. For about 9 months, our life together was as good as it had ever been. Janet got more invested in her job and even started a real estate course at home. I was happy with how things were going and grateful to have my loving wife back. Then, out of nowhere, came a mix of good news and bad news. The good news was that I was slowly but surely moving up at work. After 5 years with the company, my future looked bright. Then came a big merger with an Atlanta-based firm, which meant my job changed overnight. I was suddenly responsible for training new staff and making tough decisions about who would stay and who would go. It was a big challenge, but I was excited for it. The bad news? The new role meant I'd be traveling a lot more, spending more time out of town and away from home for longer stretches. Janet wasn't exactly thrilled about this. At first, being home on weekends was enough to smooth things over, but over time, even that wasn't cutting it. Janet grew convinced that I liked being away so much, even dropping hints that maybe I had someone else in Atlanta. Nothing I said or did could change her mind. I called her at work during the day and every night at home. I sent flowers, funny cards, anything to let her know I cared. But she stayed cold toward me. It took me 6 months to finish the staff training in Atlanta, and I was finally done traveling. I even got promoted. I figured those two things would help patch things up with Janet. Turns out, I was wrong. As soon as I stopped traveling, Janet started working longer hours herself. When I asked why, she'd fire back with some sarcastic remark about it being her turn to work for a promotion. She'd even say that now I could find out what it felt like to be home alone at night. Our marriage had hit a wall, and our intimacy was all but gone. About 2 weeks back, Janet mentioned that she and some of her coworkers from the agency would be heading out of town for the weekend. They were supposed to meet a developer who was starting construction on some high-rise condos down by the river. She made it clear how important it was for her career to get in with this developer right from the start. There was no discussion about whether I was okay with her being gone all weekend. She'd made up her mind, and that was that. Even though I'd left the junior mafia days behind me after high school, I still kept in touch with a few of my closest friends, especially Carmen. I gave him a call and asked if he wanted to catch the Steelers vs. Raiders game on Sunday. He didn't even have to think about it, we were going. Carmen always seemed to know how to get his hands on the best tickets for Steelers games. I let him know Janet would be gone on business that weekend, so he told me to plan on hanging out with him and the old crew. He said we could catch up on all the neighborhood gossip. Honestly, the idea of a weekend away from the house and all the marriage tension sounded pretty great. I didn't feel the need to tell Janet about my plans. Friday morning was another cold, silent breakfast for us. I asked Janet if she had a number where I could reach her while she was away. She barely looked up and told me not to bother calling, since she'd be busy with important people and didn't want to feel like a teenager being checked up on by her dad. I let it go. That afternoon, Janet grabbed her bag and headed off to the airport, bound for Atlantic City. Carmen was genuinely happy to see me. It had been more than a year since we'd gotten together, and I was apparently one of the few guys from our old crew who managed to make it out of the neighborhood without landing in jail again. Carmen would always remind me about the favor I did for him years ago. "Anything you need, JC, just call me and I'll handle it," he'd say. Saturday night, we wound up at the Sweet Pussycat Lounge on the southeast side of town. The place was a little rough around the edges and could have passed for something straight out of a mobster TV show. There were a bunch of young women dancing on stage, some making their rounds among the crowd. A young woman, she couldn't have been more than 18, came over and started trying to get my attention, moving to the music right in front of me. Carmen nudged me and laughed, saying, "Go for it, JC, she's all yours tonight if you want." He put his arm around her and tried to play the big shot. I just shook my head. "Sorry, Carmen, you know me. I stick to my wedding vows." Tempting, sure, but I believe in loyalty and staying true. The young woman pouted for a second, then wandered off to find someone else in the crowd. Carmen just stared at me for a second. "Man, you're really serious about this loyalty thing, aren't you?" "That's right," I said. "Without trust, there's no marriage, no love. That's how I see it." The next morning came with that familiar cold, windy Pittsburgh weather, but it didn't stop a sea of fans from heading to Three Rivers Stadium for the big Steelers-Raiders game. The rivalry between those two teams runs deep, almost like a feud that never ends. Ever since Franco Harris pulled off that miracle catch back in the day, neither side has forgotten it. It's a good thing the only fighting allowed is on the field. The Steelers weren't having their best season, standing at 5 wins and 5 losses, but this game was huge. The whole afternoon was just a brutal, hard-fought battle. I was shouting myself hoarse, but in the end, the Steelers pulled it out, 21-20 over the Raiders. Couldn't have asked for a better way to end the weekend. Or at least, that's what I thought. Carmen tried to get me to stick around with the guys afterward and really let loose, but I knew I had work the next day and didn't need to show up with a headache. Plus, Janet was supposed to be coming home that night, and I wanted to be there when she got in. But Janet didn't come home Sunday night. I headed off to work Monday morning, but there was a heaviness in my chest I couldn't shake. Lately, every time I thought about my marriage, I had this sinking feeling, like we were headed for something bad. I kept telling myself that every marriage has its ups and downs, but maybe ours had turned into something worse than a rough patch. Work that day was exactly as busy as I expected, full of high-pressure meetings and a harassment lawsuit on my desk. It wasn't until 5:30 that I finally got a chance to check my email. I scrolled through a dozen messages about work stuff, and then one subject line jumped out at me: "Who is the last one to know?" Figuring it was some kind of joke or office meme, I opened it. But instead, I was staring at a picture of Janet in the arms of another man, kissing him like they were the only two people in the world. At the bottom of the photo, there was a line of text: "Want to know what happened after this? Click on the next link." I sat there frozen, a cold chill running up my back. After a moment, I clicked the link. The next photo appeared, Janet and the same man, both clearly in a hotel room, and the way they were standing together told me everything I needed to know. Again, there was a message: "Want to know what happened after this? Click on the next link." My hands started to shake, and I felt a lump in my throat. I didn't want to see more, but I couldn't stop myself from clicking again. The third photo left no doubt. Janet was with that man in a way I never thought I'd see. My heart just sank. The woman I'd loved and trusted with everything I had was unfaithful, and suddenly, my whole world came crashing down. At the bottom of that final photo, the words stared back at me: "Photo courtesy of Robert Toldson." Everything clicked into place. The coldness Janet had shown me these last few months was more than just frustration or distance. It was the sign of a marriage that was falling apart. So what comes after anger and heartbreak? For me, it was a quiet resolve, something I hadn't felt in years. I knew I couldn't let this betrayal stand. In my mind, someone was going to answer for what they'd done. My first thoughts went to the person who sent those emails. There was no name, no clue where they'd come from. The question spun around in my head: Why send this to me? What was their angle? Were they trying to hurt me, or hurt Janet? I figured I'd have to get to the bottom of that soon enough. I slid a CD into my computer and saved copies of the email and those 3 pictures. Then, I wiped the email from my account and ran a program to make sure there was no digital trace left behind. Leaning back in my chair, I tried to make sense of what Janet had done to our marriage. The only explanation I could land on was blaming it all on her complicated, unpredictable personality. Still, if she had just wanted out, I would have given her a divorce. We could have gone our separate ways. But after what I'd seen, my mind was set on payback. There would be no turning back now, no mercy for either of them. The plan started taking shape in my head as I left work and walked over to a nearby payphone. I dialed a number for a burner cell, one that couldn't be traced. "Carmen, looks like it's time for you to make good on that old debt you owe me." When I got home around 7:30, Janet was already on the couch watching TV. There was no hug, no greeting, just a quick glance and, "You're coming home late." I shrugged, heading to the kitchen. "So were you." That was about all I had to say. We left it at that. I grabbed a beer and went down the hall to the spare room I'd turned into my office, locking the door behind me. You know, when someone gets convicted of a serious crime in this country, the punishment is usually either life in prison or the death penalty. In my mind, my revenge plan had one of each. There'd be no leniency, no second chances. I needed quiet to map out the rest of my plan. Carmen would handle things with Robert Toldson. As for Janet, that would be up to me. I wanted everything to look to the police like Janet just up and left her loving husband without a trace. Over the next couple of days, I played my part. I sent flowers to Janet's office, making sure everyone could see I was still the devoted husband. I even made dinner reservations at a restaurant near her work and left messages for her to meet me there. She never showed. I told the maitre d' to give our table away and made sure he noticed I'd been stood up. Janet came home late that evening. She didn't offer any explanation or excuse for missing dinner, and honestly, I didn't care. At this point, it was all set in motion. The following day, a courier brought an envelope to my office marked personal and confidential. Inside, a single sheet of paper read "Destroy" after reading in bold. The first line said, "Get an airtight alibi for tomorrow night." Below that was a name, Carlos Mandara, and a phone number. I memorized the number, then shredded the paper and scattered the pieces in several different trash cans outside. That evening, I got home before Janet. I changed clothes, poured myself a stiff drink, and listened to some jazz. No TV. This was my night to claim a little peace, king of my castle, even if only for an evening. Janet could find her own way to unwind. When she came in, she didn't say a word, just took one look, turned around, and went back out. Maybe she was going to eat, maybe to see Robert. At that point, I didn't care. Time was running out for both of them. By the time Janet finally came home and slipped into bed, I was already half asleep. The silence between us felt heavier than ever. Thursday nights were poker nights with the guys from work. I joined mostly to keep up with the latest office rumors. It's funny what people let slip after a couple drinks. The game was held in a back room at the old Stagecoach bar. That night, poker gave me the perfect alibi. I didn't get home until almost 3 in the morning. Janet was asleep, or at least pretending to be, and I crawled into bed, exhausted but satisfied that everything was on track. With Robert Toldson out of the picture, it was time to settle things with Janet. I wasn't in any rush, her punishment would be just as complete, but slower. The phone call to Carlos was all it would take to set her new life in motion. Whatever it was about Janet that made her think she could treat me so badly, that was her problem now. I didn't feel anything for her anymore, not love, not pity. She'd made her choices, and now she'd deal with the consequences. The police started interviewing everyone at Calcas Realty Agency, gathering statements about Robert's murder. Janet was called in more than once. Detective Lawrence Backton came by our house to ask about Robert. I told him I'd only met Robert once, at a company Christmas party. That was it, and I hadn't seen or talked to him since. The detective tried to hint around that maybe Janet and Robert were more than just colleagues, but I kept my answers steady. I told him I trusted my wife completely and had no reason to doubt her. He just gave me a look, half smiling, like he knew I was hiding something or thought I was clueless. The funeral for Robert was held that Tuesday. I watched Janet get ready in the same black dress she'd worn for my mother's funeral. She never asked if I wanted to come along, and I never offered. Whatever was going on in her head, about the affair, about Robert's death, she kept it to herself. That week, Janet tried more than once to talk about our marriage. But I shut her down each time. I wasn't interested in fixing anything, not after what I'd seen and done. I had my hand on the switch, ready to end things for good whenever I felt like it. 3 weeks after Robert's death, the police seemed to hit a dead end. There were rumors that maybe Robert had gotten mixed up with a bookie or a loan shark. During those weeks, Janet was falling apart. She seemed distracted, scared of every little thing. I watched her unravel and didn't lift a finger to help. She was on her own now. Finally, on the next Thursday, I made the call to Carlos. He said everything was ready. Janet's new life was about to start, and she had no idea what was coming. Friday morning, I left for work before Janet was even up. I didn't want to see her one last time, not after everything that had happened. There was a car with 2 men in it parked across the street. Janet's kidnapping was quick and clean. At a 4-way stop, 2 cars boxed her in. In less than 30 seconds, 2 guys moved in, opened her door, injected her with something, and cut her seatbelt. Janet was moved to the passenger seat, and one of the men took the wheel. All 3 cars pulled away, and just like that, they were gone. Not a single witness saw a thing. At 11 o'clock that morning, across town at a branch bank, a woman who could have passed for Janet, down to the hair, clothes, and mannerisms, walked right up to the counter and handed the teller a slip to withdraw $25,000 from our joint account. She had all the right documents, a driver's license and a passport with Janet's name and picture. The teller took a few minutes to process the withdrawal and finally handed over a cashier's check. A security guard even escorted the woman outside, noting her license plate as she drove off. Later that day, the same Janet double made her way through the line at the American Airlines ticket counter. She presented her photo ID, picked up a boarding pass, everything matched. The tickets had been booked online the night before. First, she'd fly to JFK, then catch a nonstop to Rio de Janeiro. The Pittsburgh flight left at 4:45 p.m., and by 10:30 that night, Janet Canla was on her way to Brazil. I waited until noon on Saturday to report Janet missing. Oddly enough, Detective Lawrence Backton was the one who came out to take my statement. I told him Janet hadn't come home like usual, and when I tried to call her cell, I just got a not-in-service message. I even checked in with one of her friends from work, Amanda Stoccata, who told me Janet hadn't shown up at the office and hadn't called in either. Detective Backton took some notes in his pad, giving me a look every now and then, probably trying to read me. Then he started asking questions about our marriage, if we'd been having problems and if those issues might have anything to do with Janet's disappearance. I stuck to my story, the same one I gave him after the Toldson case. I told him everything was fine, and there was no way Janet would just leave on her own. He pressed me, asking if I might have had something to do with Janet's disappearance. I gave him my best innocent face and told him I loved my wife and could never hurt her. Truth is, I'd learned how to put on a good show for the cops back in my younger days. Old habits die hard. 3 days later, Detective Backton showed up at my office in the middle of the workday. I guess he wanted to size me up. Once he sat down across from my desk, he flashed a tight smile. "Any word on Janet?" I asked, doing my best to sound like a worried husband. "Yes and no, Mr. Canla. We've retraced Janet's steps after she left your house Friday. She was seen having coffee at the Denny's on Bennett Street around 10 a.m. Then, at 11 o'clock, she went to the Allegheny National Bank. We have surveillance footage of her at the teller window, making a $25,000 withdrawal from your joint savings." Backton paused, looking for a reaction. I did my best to look shocked. "Janet took $25,000 out of our account? That can't be right. She didn't say a word to me about needing money." "The evidence is pretty clear. The teller made copies of her ID and passport before issuing the check. Once you see the video, I'm sure you'll agree it was your wife." Again, Backton watched my face for clues. "I still think there must be a mistake, Detective. Janet and I talked about everything. If she needed money, she would have told me." I kept my expression confused and worried, backing up my story. He just kept coming. "The bigger news, Mr. Canla, is that your wife bought airline tickets to New York and then on to Rio de Janeiro. We found her car parked in the airport's long-term lot. The records show she left for JFK at 4:45 p.m., and her connecting flight to Rio took off at 10:30 that night. We've reached out to the police in Rio, but she seems to have disappeared after arriving there." Now he was staring straight at me, waiting to see how I'd react. I threw myself into the act. No. This can't be happening. Janet wouldn't just run off like that. She loves me, and I love her. This doesn't make any sense. I even worked up a few tears for effect. There was an awkward silence before Backton finally spoke again. "Do you think any of this might be connected to Robert Toldson's murder?" "What? How can you even ask that?" My wife had nothing to do with that murder, you interviewed her yourself. She was never even charged. We never brought charges, but she was high on our list of suspects. Several people from her office thought Janet and Toldson were close, maybe more than just colleagues. His eyes bored into me, trying to get a rise. You have got to be kidding me. First, you're telling me my wife ran off to Brazil, and now you're accusing her of murder? You better have more than office gossip before you start pointing fingers. I was getting heated, just as I wanted. We're still investigating, Mr. Canla. With your wife leaving the country, our suspicions have only grown. There was evidence at the crime scene that suggested the murder wasn't just about money. The attack on Toldson was vicious, and there were signs of personal motives involved. I gave a dry laugh. And you think my petite wife could pull something like that off? She can barely open a jar, let alone take someone's life. Your theory is falling apart, detective. He didn't budge. Maybe so, but the evidence suggests your wife was involved. She might have had help. So now I'm the suspect? I cut him off, not letting him get ahead of me. We considered you, but you had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, he admitted, but didn't sound convinced. Let me get this straight, I said, staring right at him. You don't know where my wife is, you think she left the country because she was part of a murder, and now you're saying I might be mixed up in it too? Did I get that right, detective? He just looked at me, trying to figure out if I was bluffing or genuinely angry. Anything else, detective? Because if not, this conversation is over. I stood up, opened the door, and waited. Acton finally got up and left, promising to keep me informed about the case. We didn't shake hands. After he was gone, I sat back and replayed every word, every question. It was clear Acton suspected I was hiding something. But as far as he knew, my alibis held up. I was playing poker the night Robert was killed, and I'd been in meetings all day the Friday Janet went missing. By Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Janet disappeared, I still hadn't heard a word from Carlos or Carmen. I had no idea where Janet really was, or what her life looked like now. Sometimes, I even felt like I was being watched, maybe by the police, maybe by someone else, when I left for work or came home at night. I kept my routine simple and predictable. I'd go to work, come home, maybe stop at the grocery store, but never did anything that would look suspicious or out of the ordinary. Every couple of days, I'd check in with Detective Acton about Janet, but there was never any new information. The police in Brazil hadn't found any trace of her after she supposedly landed in Rio. That Saturday afternoon, I ordered a pizza and settled in to watch some college football. When the doorbell rang, it was just the delivery guy with my pizza. As I opened the box in the kitchen, I spotted an envelope sitting on top. I opened it and read the message inside. Tomorrow morning, dress for church. Go to the 10 o'clock Mass at St. Peter's. During communion, slip out the east side door. There will be a dark Ford Crown Victoria waiting. Get in. Reading that note, I realized this was likely the last time I'd ever see Janet. Carlos had waited a full 2 weeks before reaching out, making sure the cover story, that Janet left the country, was airtight. If anyone checked, all the evidence pointed to her running off to Brazil. That night, I stared up at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. The past month and a half had been a nightmare, one set off by a single email. In moments like these, I wondered if my stubborn side came from my upbringing or if it was just in my blood. St. Peter's was packed for the 10 o'clock Mass, making it easy to blend in. If the police were following me, they'd have lost me in the crowd. When it was time for communion, I quietly slipped out the side door as instructed. Outside, a black Ford sedan waited, engine running. I got in, and the car quickly disappeared into the morning traffic. After about 10 minutes, we pulled up at a large, nondescript warehouse. The driver just told me to go in through the side entrance. The warehouse was mostly empty except for a lit office area at the back. As I walked over, Carlos stepped out to greet me. "Hello, JC," he said, shaking my hand. "Carmen said it was all right to call you that." He studied me for a moment and then asked, "Are you sure you want to see your wife? It's been a rough few weeks for her." I didn't hesitate. I'm past the point of caring. I just want to get this over with. He led me inside the well-lit room. There was Janet. She looked nothing like the woman I once knew. She stood there, clearly shaken and exhausted. It was obvious she'd been through a lot since she disappeared. Her spirit seemed broken, her eyes empty and distant, staring straight ahead. She made no sound, no movement, and hardly even acknowledged my presence. Carlos quietly explained that she hadn't been drugged, but life had been hard for her these past weeks. "She's not the same person you remember, JC. She's lost that old spark, he said. I looked at Janet for a moment longer, but there was nothing left to say. She was a shadow of her former self, standing there silently. Whatever had happened to her since Carlos took over, she had clearly given up. I finally spoke, my voice steady. For the rest of your life, Janet, you'll remember what led you here. I put up with a lot in our marriage, but I couldn't overlook the betrayal. What happens next is out of my hands. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't say a word. That was all the reaction I got. After another moment, I nodded at Carlos and turned to leave. The driver brought me back to St. Peter's just as the 11 o'clock Mass was ending. I slipped into the church, blending in with the crowd, then quietly left and headed home. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and tried to settle the knot in my stomach, knowing that my story with Janet had truly come to an end. Epilogue. It's been 3 years since I last saw Janet, and to be honest, it almost feels like another lifetime. She's completely gone from my world now. I even sold the house we shared back when she disappeared. There isn't a trace of her left in my daily life. Detective Bacton's cases, both Janet's disappearance and the murder of Robert Toldson, have been shuffled off to the cold case files. No new leads, no movement, and no real hope of answers as far as the police are concerned. These days, I find myself hanging out with Carmen more often, usually at the Sweet Pussycat Lounge. That sweet young dancer Carmen once introduced me to? Let's just say we've gotten to know each other pretty well, and I've enjoyed her company more than once. I guess some things really do come full circle. As for marriage? Not a chance. After everything I went through with Janet, I'm convinced tying the knot just isn't worth the headache. My 5 years with her taught me more than enough. Turns out, my parents were right all along. They warned me I'd regret getting mixed up with Janet. Funny how we rarely listen to good advice when we're young. One last thing, turns out it was Amanda Stoccata who sent me that email with the photos. Apparently, she'd been involved with Robert Toldson before he left her for Janet. I never did thank her for blowing the lid off everything, and I still have no clue how she managed to get those pictures. In the end, I guess she got her own kind of revenge right alongside mine. There's an old saying about the fury of a woman scorned. Maybe folks should add a note, don't mess with JC, either.